All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. We're diving into a really, I guess, a sensitive topic, maybe even a little bit controversial today, at least in certain circles.
Right.
We're going to be looking at government consulting contracts.
Yeah, those are always a fun topic.
Well, and specifically the kind of, I don't know, maybe increased attention, scrutiny, whatever the right word is, that they've been getting lately, especially from, well, I guess two main players, I'd say. First off, you always have the GSA, the General Services Administration.
Yeah.
They kind of, oversee a lot of this stuff. But then there's also this newer agency that folks might not be as familiar with, the Department of Government Efficiency,
Mm-hmm.
or DOGE is what everyone calls it, I guess. And I mean, it's right there in the name, right?
Yeah.
Their whole thing is, well, making sure the government's spending money efficiently, that taxpayer dollars are not being wasted.
Right, absolutely. And there's a lot of focus right now on these contracts going to outside consultants.
Exactly.
A lot of scrutiny. And I think a lot of what's fueling this is, when you look at some of the biggest names in the industry, you see these huge amounts of money that are just sitting there in these contracts ceiling.
Billions, right.
Billions, yeah. Billions of dollars that haven't actually been spent.
Unexercised, yeah.
Unexercised, that's the word.
Okay. So we actually have this is based on some really great analysis from a group called TechnoMile.
Right. They do some great work.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of use that as our jumping off point today, to really try and get our heads around, first of all, just how much money we are talking about.
Yeah.
What's the scale of this?
So how big is this problem?
Yeah, exactly.
And then, what does it mean for everyone?
Yeah.
If the government really is cracking down on this stuff.
Well, and not even just cracking down. I mean, are we going to see changes in, like, how the government even approaches these types of needs?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Like, are they going to rethink the whole model? Potentially.
So yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
A lot to unpack.
So, okay, let's get into it.
Let's do it.
So first off, who are we even talking about here?
Right.
TechnoMile, they didn't look at every single government contractor. They kind of focused on what the GSA considers like the top 10 in terms of the federal market.
Right, the big fish.
Yeah, the big fish. And these are names everyone's going to recognize.
Yeah.
You've got Accenture Federal Services. You got Booz Allen Hamilton.
Of course, yeah.
CGI Federal.
Yep.
Deloitte. General Dynamics IT.
Big names.
Guidehouse, HII Mission Technologies.
Familiar faces.
IBM.
Uh-huh.
Leidos. And then Science Applications International Corps.
Yeah, so we're talking about some really major players here. These are not, your small mom and pop shops.
No, not at all.
These are companies that have a huge presence in the federal market.
Yeah, they're the big dog.
Exactly. And what TechnoMile did was they went through and they looked at the contract ceilings.
For these 10 companies.
Yeah.
And they also looked at the options that are built into those contracts, those kind of things that could potentially increase the value even further down the line.
Right.
And they broke all that down by category, what are these contracts actually for?
Uh-huh.
And that's where things start to get really interesting.
Yeah, and that's where those huge numbers start coming in.
Exactly.
So, okay, so what did they find?
Well, the biggest category, I guess the one that really jumped out, was something they called management and advisory services.
Okay.
And TechnoMile themselves pointed out that this is probably what most people think of when they hear the word consulting.
Right. Yeah, the stereotypical consultant.
Exactly.
Coming in, doing some analysis, giving some advice, making a PowerPoint.
Exactly. And for that category alone, they found $25.3 billion in unexercised ceiling.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a big number.
Huge.
Yeah, a really big number.
Huh?
And then, it doesn't stop there. They also found another $13.6 billion in something called application work,
Okay.
and then $8.7 billion in technical and engineering services.
Got it. So that's your top three.
Yeah, that's your top three.
But I mean, that adds up to what, like almost 50 billion already, right?
Yeah, you're getting close to $50 billion just with those three categories.
And that's all money that has been, allocated in a sense. Like these companies could potentially bill the government for that.
Right, that's the ceiling. That's the max.
Yeah, the max. But they haven't yet.
Exactly.
And then on top of all that, there's another $1 billion.
At least.
Yeah, at least another billion spread across a whole bunch of other random government needs.
Yeah, and it's really a mix. You've got obvious stuff like technology and equipment and IT, but then you also have social services, equipment maintenance.
Yeah, they even had stuff like operational systems development. And this one was kind of surprising, ammunition and explosives.
Yeah, yeah, it's a really wide range. It kind of shows you like how far-reaching these contracts can be. It's not just about, the typical things that you might think of when you think of government contracts.
It's not just fighter jets and, office supplies.
Exactly.
You think consulting, you do think of like PowerPoints and, meetings and that kind of stuff.
Right.
But then, to see ammunition and explosives,
Yeah, it's interesting.
it's like, whoa, okay, so this is a much broader category
Yeah.
than maybe people would assume.
And I think that actually gets to one of the really tricky things that TechnoMile points out in their analysis, which is how do you even define consulting work?
Right.
Like when you're looking at all these different government codes, the PSC codes, the NAACS codes, the way the government categorizes its spending,
Uh-huh.
there isn't really a nice, neat, clear label for consulting.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it makes it really hard to say definitively, like, okay, this is exactly how much the government is spending on consulting. It gets kind of blurry.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And I think that actually explains some of the differences that we see when we compare TechnoMile's numbers to what the GSA has said.
Oh, right. Because their numbers were different, weren't they?
Yeah. So TechnoMile, when they looked at all of this across all those categories, they said that the total unexercised ceiling for those 10 companies was $94 billion.
94 billion.
Yeah. But the GSA came out and they said that those same 10 companies could potentially make $65 billion in consulting fees.
Okay, so that's a pretty big difference.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it has to do with, like, how are you defining consulting? What are you including in that?
Right.
Like maybe the GSA is looking at a much narrower slice of things.
Focusing more on that, like stereotypical, we come in, we give advice, we write a report, we leave, kind of consulting.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe they're also taking into account things like historical utilization rates.
Uh-huh.
Like, okay, on average, how much of these contract ceilings do companies actually end up using?
Right.
But either way, I mean, whether you're talking about 94 billion or 65 billion,
It's a lot.
it's a lot of money.
It's a ton of money.
And the fact that it's just kind of sitting there unexercised,
Yeah.
that's what's really getting the attention of folks like the GSA and DOGE.
Right. And it does seem like that attention it's already having some impact.
Oh, yeah.
Because, we've seen reports of some pretty major contract cancellations.
Yeah.
I think IBM and Accenture, I think those were the ones that I saw.
Right, right. And those reports specifically said that this increased scrutiny on consulting contracts was part of the reason why.
So they're not just saying like, oh, we don't need this service anymore. They're actually pointing to this like broader change in how the government is looking at these contracts.
Yeah. I mean, it suggests that the government is really serious about this. Like, they're not just talking.
They're walking the walk.
They're walking the walk. And, we also heard from Leidos, one of the other companies on that list, and they said that only about 1% of their revenue actually comes from what they would call consulting.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. I think that's really important because it shows you that, a lot of these big government contractors, they do a lot of different things.
Right. They're more than just consultants.
Exactly. And so, even if some of their contracts are getting canceled, or even if the government is scrutinizing them more closely, they still have all these other lines of business.
Yeah, they're diversified.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think the key takeaway from all of this,
Yeah.
from the TechnoMile report, from the GSA statements, from these cancellations,
Uh-huh.
it's that these top 10 companies, they have a lot of exposure
Yeah.
through these big unexercised contract ceilings.
Right.
And the government has a lot of leverage.
Because they could just choose not to exercise those options.
Exactly.
And if that happens, I mean, that could really impact those companies' bottom lines.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it could also open up opportunities for other types of providers.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to put it all in perspective, like, regardless of whether you're using TechnoMile's number of 94 billion or the GSA's estimate of 65 billion,
Right.
that's still a massive amount of money.
Huge amount.
And it represents like a lot of potential risk for these companies.
Yeah. I mean, that's the big question here, right? Like, what's going to happen?
Exactly.
Is the government going to start exercising fewer of these options?
Sure.
Are they going to start rethinking how they approach these types of needs?
Like maybe they'll try to bring more of that work in-house.
Potentially. Or, maybe they'll start looking for smaller, more specialized providers.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so, for you, the listener, like, why should you care about this?
Right.
Well, because this is all part of a bigger picture. We're talking about how the government spends money.
Right. Taxpayer dollars.
Taxpayer dollars.
Yeah.
And if we start seeing these big shifts in spending priorities,
Yeah.
if we see the government being more careful about how it uses outside expertise,
Yeah.
that's going to have ripple effects throughout the entire federal market.
Makes sense.
So even if you're not directly involved in government contracting, this is something to pay attention to because it could affect the types of services that the government prioritizes.
Mm.
It could affect the level of competition within the market, and ultimately, it could affect the overall efficiency and effectiveness of the government.
So it's kind of like a bellwether in a way.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so let's recap, kind of bring it all together.
Okay.
So on one hand, you've got these billions of dollars sitting in these unexercised contract ceilings
Right.
held by these big, powerful companies.
Yep.
And on the other hand, you've got the GSA, you've got DOGE really starting to take a closer look. And, maybe even, turning the screws a little bit.
Yeah, putting on the pressure.
Yeah, exactly. So what's going to happen? I mean, that's really the big question, right?
That is the big question. And, it's a question that we don't have the answer to right now,
Right.
but it's something that we're all going to have to watch very closely.
Yeah. And I think it's something that could really lead to some interesting, I don't know, maybe even some innovative changes.
Absolutely.
Because, if the government's not happy with the current model, they're going to have to find a new one.
Right. And that could mean new types of contractual agreements.
Mm-hmm.
It could mean more investment in building internal capabilities.
Right.
Or it could mean the rise of new, maybe more specialized, or maybe even more cost-effective providers.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
that.
that's a great point. So, I mean, for everyone listening out there, like this is a story that's still unfolding.
Absolutely.
So stay tuned, keep an eye on this, do your own research.
Yeah.
And think about those questions. Like, what are the alternative solutions here?
Right. What's the future going to look like?
Yeah, what does the future hold?
Yeah, because this is something that could have a big impact on all of us.
All right, well, that's going to do it for us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, it was great having you, as always. And we'll see you all next time
See ya.
for another deep dive.
Bye-bye.